At the end of the fourth talk, I left you at the moment where it was quite clear that there was going to be a war. General Gage and his redcoats had attempted to take Bunker Hill outside Boston. They had succeeded, but at a pretty high cost. American rebels, as they were called, on top of the hill had to give way, but they exacted a very high price for their defeat. Nearly half of Gage's men were either killed or wounded. So there was most definitely a war on, which immediately raised the question, how was it to be fought? No point in having a war unless you're going to fight it. And there were 3,000 miles between the two sides. Well, obviously, the Americans couldn't put all their soldiers and sailors into boats and go across the Atlantic and attack England. So England had to send an army, or two or three, over to America to put the rebellion down. After all, it was the Americans who were, in legal terms, it was the Americans who were breaking the law. They had to be punished. Trouble was, neither side had any particularly clear idea of the nature of their opponents. As far as I'm aware, no leading American politician visited England, either certainly not during the war, and I don't think in the run-up to the war either. And equally certainly, no British Prime Minister went over to America to try and find out for himself what the nature of the problem was. There was no fact-finding tour by a delegation from Parliament. So ignorance was pretty widespread. And before you chuckle in a superior sort of way about these poor, ignorant bumpkins who knew nothing about political history or geography, think about it now, even now in the 21st century, with television and the internet and Mr. and Mrs. Google and the telephone and all the rest of it. How many Englishmen could put Idaho and Wisconsin and Kentucky accurately on the map of the United States? And by the same token, how many Americans could accurately place Norfolk or Devon or Cumbria on the map of England? Ignorance is a great survivor of progress. So if they were a bit short on knowledge, what have they got? They had a set of ideals which coalesced into what subsequently became, in effect, a legend. And the legend was that the American war became a movement, a united movement of noble, self-effacing patriots against a tyrant king and a bullying parliament. And victory was going to be inevitable and very well deserved. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't quite like that. There's too much evidence against it. I'm not suggesting that the legend is worthless, and I'm not saying that the legend is 100% not true. I'm simply saying it's a legend, and therefore it is not 100% true. There were so many divisions. You think of geography for a moment. The colonists stretched over 1,500 miles. That is one hell of a long way. You think of as I said, 1,500 miles, think of the distance. There was no motor car, there was no train, there was no aeroplane, there was no telephone, there was no telegraph, no television, no instant electronic contact of any kind. The fastest means of travel was a man on a horse. No matter how rich you were, no matter how powerful you were, nobody could travel faster than 15 miles an hour. Slow things up a bit, didn't it? There were divisions not only of geography, there were divisions of climate. Again, over 1,500 miles. Think for a moment. There were men in the northern colonies who set out in their sailing boats to catch Arctic whales. There were men in southern colonies on the edge of running into crocodiles in tropical swamps. You think of the huge variety. There were men who earned their living in trade. There were men who earned their living chopping down trees. There were men who earned their living fishing. Farmers, obviously, lots of them, plantation owners, slaves, different lifestyle altogether, poor souls. So there were differences in lifestyle. There were differences of religion. The Irish immigrants brought the Catholic element. The Scots, they were great emigrators too, brought their version of it with Presbyterianism. The Dutch added a Calvinist ingredient. The Germans brought Lutheranism. And not only all that, think of all the French and the Spanish. That area had been French and Spanish colonies before, behind the Allegheny Mountains. That was why the Americans were so afraid of being boxed in. But when the English won the 7 Years' War and cleared out the Spanish and the French, all they cleared out was the Spanish and the French government. They didn't clear out all the Spanish and the French people. There must have been a lot. I don't think anybody ran a census. But think of it, there must have been thousands of French and Spanish there as well, with their own lifestyle, their own culture, their own religion, their own language. Think of the variety. And they certainly all weren't getting on with each other, and they certainly didn't all like each other. The Church of England belittled the Quakers. Everybody belittled the Quakers. Nearly everybody, even more than those who belittled the Quakers, nearly everybody suspected the Catholics. There was no such thing as a trustworthy Catholic. And the Puritans up in the north, in New England, disapproved of nearly everybody. I made the point in a previous talk that you had horizontal and vertical divisions too. The colonies in the north, Massachusetts and so on, were completely different from the ones in the middle, the farming element in the middle, and they were different in turn, both of them, from the plantation owners in the deep south. And it worked north and south as well. The ones on the eastern seaboard, the colonies were older, they settled down more, they developed, they built towns, cities with proper streets, they had colleges, they had universities, they had newspapers, and they were very sure of themselves and pretty smug about it all too, pretty sophisticated with their port wine and their fancy furniture and their pianos imported from England. On the far west, on the other side, were still these rough-hewn ladies and gentlemen, these pioneer families, hacking a living, hacking a civilization out of the forest. That wherever you went, there was variety all over the place. And as I said, not many of them thought very highly of many of the others as well. If ever, the seeds of disunity were sown absolutely everywhere. Now, how did it seem to Lord North? In one sense, it was more difficult. In another sense, it was more simple. It was more difficult in that he had to fight a war 3,000 miles away. You think of the distance, you think how long it took a ship to cross the Atlantic and come back again. You send orders, it would take 3 or 4 weeks to reach the other side. The answer to the orders would come back, would take another 3 or 4 weeks. You think how quickly a military situation can change. Never mind 3 or 4 weeks or 7 or 8, it could change in 24 hours. How do you possibly conduct a campaign so far away? Now, on the other hand, for North, it was simple in that he was not aware of the huge variety of differences that I've just tried to outline to you. To him, there were 13 colonies. They were all being difficult. They were all being awkward. And now that the war had broke out, they were all breaking the law. So that did simplify things somewhat. North, his responsibility, his job, was to bring the colonists to heel, to make them mind, to stop them being naughty children. Well, it wasn't quite as simple as that, but I'm trying to make the point that North may have appeared to the Americans as a bully. The Americans may have decided from what they heard about North that he was a bully, but he wasn't. He was an ordinary, run-of-the-mill politician, a typical English nobleman who found himself in office in Downing Street, and it was his job to run the country, to make people keep the law and make everybody mind. He had no choice. He had to enforce the law. Well, how can I suppose I'll have to reinforce it by saying that North, there was nothing else he could do except say to the Americans, you must obey the law, otherwise you will be punished. If he had shown more imagination, he might have come up with a better answer. For example, it has been suggested that when the Americans said no taxation without representation, if North had taken them at their word, and he said, all right, we'll give you some MPs, elect a few, and send them over, and we'll put them in Westminster, and they can sit in the House of Commons, representing colonies. How many bills would they have been able to lay before Parliament that stood any chance at all of passing? How many times would they be? Well, they'd be outvoted every single time. But North would have given them what they asked for, wouldn't have got them anywhere. Think of all those divisions I spoke about. If North had exploited only 2 or 3 of them, it would have possibly held the colonists back. The eastern seaboarders, with their fancy manners and their silk stockings, didn't think much of the bumpkin pioneers. North could have used that. He could have used the differences between the Massachusetts fishermen and the Georgian plantation owners. He could have done something to stop the Americans getting together. Damn it, it was difficult enough to make them get together anyway. He didn't need a great deal of assistance to make them fall apart. But North didn't do it. Now then, think for a moment. If you were a betting man in 1775, when the war broke out, where would you have put your money? If you were an American, I say, think about it. Be logical for a moment and be fair. The Americans were rebelling. They had raised arms against their legal sovereign. They had broken the law. They had committed high treason. Never mind what history said 50, 100 years later. At that time, they had committed high treason. It was a hanging offence. So they started off as something of a disadvantage. It's not very nice to be in the wrong. They had no army. They might have had troops in each individual colony, but there was no national army. There was certainly no standing army. The Americans always hated standing armies. By the same token, there was no navy. They hadn't got the funds for it. They had no shipyards building warships all the time. They had no factories producing munitions, guns and muskets and cannons and ammunition. They had to go and buy it elsewhere. Pardon me. They had no money in the sense that there was no nationwide, I can't even use the word nation because they weren't a nation. There was no universal treasury. Sooner or later, they had to put one together, but when the war started, they had nothing. So no unity, no money, no munitions, no navy, no army, no law on their side, and not only no law on their side, no supporters. When the news of this rebellion crossed the Atlantic and reached Europe, not one single country spoke up for them. Why? Because each country in Europe, they were the ones that mattered, Western Europe, they were all ruled by monarchs, kings, anointed kings. And this rebellion by the Americans was against another anointed king. What European monarch in his right mind, however much he hated the English, quite a few probably did, but they would never come out in favour of rebellion against a crowned head. There was no such thing as a trade union of kings, but there was a general feeling amongst kings of Europe, never written down, never organised into a trade union, but the general feeling was that no king would support any movement against another king. It was asking for trouble. They all felt, if they didn't actually say so, they subscribed to the idea that European kings must hang together, otherwise there was a danger that they would hang separately. So let's look at it for a moment now from the English point of view. It looked as if the Americans were up against it on a hiding to nothing, just get a load of what was facing England. The biggest single thing, of course, was the geography, as I said. The colonies were 3,000 miles away. How do you conduct a war so far away, when news took 4 weeks to reach the other side and another 4 weeks to come back? How do you conduct a war when a military situation, I've said this before, I'm saying it again, the situation could change in 24 hours? Worse still, from the British point of view, even if they're able to triumph over it and get some troops across the Atlantic, which they did, give them credit for that, and redcoats and their muskets and properly armed and properly supplied with munitions and all the rest of it, then they had to defeat the Americans in a set of colonies which they knew next to nothing about, in a country whose geography they knew next to nothing about, which stretched for 1,500 miles when nobody could travel faster than 15 miles an hour. And the Americans, they very soon discovered, would not obligingly line up in nice red straight lines and be shot at. They didn't behave that way. It was almost cheating. And yet the English, if they were going to make their point, if they were going to make the Americans mind, they had to beat them. It was no good fighting a war politely for 2 or 3 years and both sides saying, yeah, well, we've had enough, let's have a bit of a treaty and we'll do a bit of horse trading and everything will be all right and we'll carry on. No, the English had to win. Even the king tumbled to that. He told the prime minister, if you don't win, a draw is no good to you. A draw is as good as a lose. You've got to win. There is no such thing as a draw. If there had been, if there were to be a draw, said George, what it would mean was that the Americans would have got away with it. Bye-bye.